It's the dead of night in Colorado Springs. In a modest apartment on the south side of town, 7-year-old Michelle Osborne and her sister are fast asleep.
I remember waking up to a hot sensation on my head.
It's a smoking bullet fragment that ricocheted onto her pillow.
And I remember being very dazed, like, what is going on?
Oh my God, we gotta get out of bed now. I'm serious.
Michelle and her sister race to their parents' bedroom. Together, the Osbornes take cover from the deadly barrage.
It was just chaotic. Everybody was crying. We were trying to find a place to hide because bullets were still coming in. Honestly, with all those bullets, I don't know how we made it out.
But the Osbornes' apartment wasn't the only one hit that night.
We received numerous calls saying shots were fired, bullets impacting different apartments.
When officers initially arrived on scene, we found a number of individuals were actually outside looking around.
Hey guys, what happened?
All up over that field back there.
They was just shooting and we was ducking and running, trying not to get hit.
There were a number of people involved looking at damage and trying to make sure everyone was all right on scene.
It was just kind of chaos, what's going on, who did this kind of thing.
It appears there are no casualties until the dispatch radio begins to crackle.
Go for Watson.
We were contacted by our dispatch and advised that someone had arrived at a local hospital.
There was a passenger in a vehicle who was leaving this area when shots were fired. She was struck with a bullet. The driver of the vehicle took her immediately to hospital.
She is deceased. 10-4, copy that.
The apartment parking lot has just become a murder scene. Miles away, Lt.Joe Kenda gets the call.
Go ahead for Kenda.
And of course, it's the PD. We need you.
10-4, I'm on my way.
Without batting an eye, Kenda heads to the scene.
The 2100 block of Pruce Road is in a basically very rough neighborhood. These apartments are in poor condition. It is a place where it's not uncommon to encounter street-level crime.
But when Kenda arrives, he realizes this isn't so much a crime scene as a war zone.
The amount of gunfire in this particular incident is, even in this neighborhood, unusual. Very unusual.
Hey, Lieutenant. How you doing? All right. I got a report of one female victim.
The victim is 22-year-old Sharon Coleman, an assistant manager at a local fast food restaurant.
Sharon was a kind person. She was active at church. She was giving. She didn't hold a grudge. She didn't have enemies.
Sharon Coleman was with her boyfriend just moments before the gunfire erupted.
Her car was parked there right in front of these buildings.
Buildings that are now riddled with bullet holes and shell casings.
How many shots were fired? We got about 8 or 10 folks over here that's had their place shot up. Just shot to hell.
The bullet holes in the apartments appear to be collateral damage. Kenda heads inside the Osborne family's apartment to look for physical evidence.
One of the officers at the scene said, "Let me point out to you where this all hit." And he's showing me these bullet holes that are big bullets. They were passing through, in some cases, 4 and 5 walls.
What have you got?
Look at this.
It looks like a large caliber rifle round. Probably semi or fully automatic, that number of shots fired.
These bullets are very high velocity. This is not a handgun, it's a rifle. These types of weapons are used as military battlefield weapons. They're not intended for use by private individuals. They're combat weapons.
If they're doing a rapid fire with a full automatic weapon, They're tough to contain. AKs are notorious for not being that accurate.
It's clear that whoever shot Sharon didn't think twice about bystanders.
Someone is very serious about using a very serious weapon.
Detectives question everyone in the complex, hoping someone saw the shooter.
So, sir, tell us what you saw.
Gunfires just from all different directions from everywhere.
You didn't see nobody hit or nothing like that?
No, huh?
I just heard it.
I'm sitting there trying to eat some cereal and bullet just went right through my place.
Everybody's got a story, 20 different stories, all of which speak to how they almost died because in their minds they did. Nobody sees anything. They hear the results. They don't see the beginning.
Finally, one of Kenda's men hits upon a credible lead.
Excuse me, Lieutenant. This guy's got some information.
How you doing? I'm Detective Kenda.
Hi.
Tell me what you saw.
Well, I was sitting in my kitchen about making myself something to eat, and I heard some gunshots, so I looked out the window about out there in the field about 100 yards or so. Saw a flash, a muzzle flash.
The witness claims he saw gunfire coming from a vacant lot across the street from the apartments.
Did you see anyone doing the shooting?
No, I saw the flash, I hit the ground. When I got up, there was nothing around, it was just dark.
This is a field of about 4 acres, high grass, very difficult to search, and of course it's dark. What we're looking for are expended casings to see if this is where the shots were fired.
A search yields no casings whatsoever. But police find something else that could explain why.
Hey, Lieutenant, I think I got some over here. We've got tire tracks.
We have a shooter who's probably in a car who, for unknown reason, opens fire in this complex. Expended casings wind up inside his vehicle, and he has disappeared into the night. The only thing we know for certain is that Sharon Coleman's dead.
I was devastated when I heard about Sharon. You can't see this kind of horror coming. You just can't forecast it. It's like having a hand cut off and it's gone, and you don't know how to function anymore, because just a huge piece of you is gone.
With the Coleman family in tears, Kenda turns his attention to the last person to see Sharon alive. Her boyfriend, Sonny Wright.
We have no place else to go but to go to Sonny.
Can you tell me about your relationship with Sharon?
Me and Sharon, we actually been dating for 2 years.
Sonny and Sharon met because they were both working in the same fast food restaurant. Sharon was ambitious, so was Sonny. Everything was going very well.
Sonny explains that his mother is the one who lives in the apartment complex where the shooting occurred. Sharon was visiting her, while Sonny spent the evening at an event. He arrived back at his mother's apartment a little before 1:30 in the morning to pick her up.
How'd it go? It went good. How you been?
Good, I'm ready to go home.
Me too. Get down! Get down! Baby, you all right?
It was the kind of thing where you hear what's going on and then look over and it's like, whoa, he didn't realize that she had really even been shot.
Oh my God!
Sonny rushed Sharon to the hospital, but they couldn't save her from the bullet's destruction.
It entered her right side of the body, damaged her lungs, her heart, her liver, high blood loss, bloodletting organs, and that's what led to her ultimate death.
It's a terrible fate for a woman with her whole life ahead of her.
Could you think of anyone that would want to hurt Sharon? Anyone she had problems with?
Not her. She got along with pretty much everybody.
His opinion, she doesn't have an enemy in the world.
But Kenda realizes Sonny could have just as easily been the one killed. The question is, who was the intended target?
Okay, Sonny, then if nobody wanted to kill Sharon, maybe somebody wanted to kill you.
22-year-old Sharon Coleman, an ambitious woman just starting out in life, was gunned down outside an apartment complex on Rough and Tumble, Bruce Road.
Get down! Get down!
Sharon wanted to have just a good life, and she wanted to have kids. She wanted to have a good man and find love and settle down, and it sucks that she didn't get that opportunity.
Lt.Joe Kenda has been speaking with her boyfriend, Sonny Wright, who was with her when she was shot. Sonny isn't convinced Sharon was the intended target.
Okay, Sonny. Then if nobody wanted to kill Sharon, maybe somebody wanted to kill you. Do you have enemies?
Is it possible these shots were meant for you? Is there anyone that you were having problems with?
Well, it's this girl, China Doll. That's the only person that I can think of.
Sonny claims China Doll hangs out with gang members. He's been worried about retaliation stemming from an incident on the 4th of July.
Sonny's over at the Bruce Road Apartments. He's going to visit his mom. China Doll is in the parking lot with a couple other girls.
What the hell y'all doing to my car, man?
What'd you say?
I said, what the hell y'all doing to my car?
Do you know who the I am?
Yeah, I know who you is. Y'all some whack dirty crippets.
What'd you say? The hell up?
One of the girls pulls out a handgun and starts firing shots in the air. Sonny decides it's time to retreat, discretion being the better part of valor. The confrontation is over fireworks. It's something silly, but there's nothing silly when you get involved with gang people. It's all about protecting their image.
Which makes China Doll a prime suspect.
This girl is part of, or at least associated with, a gang. She is angry with Sonny. Could this have resulted in her getting her boyfriends, the gangbangers, who fire some rounds at Sonny? Of course it could.
The Police Intelligence Unit IDs China Doll as 19-year-old Donna Washington. There's already an outstanding warrant for her arrest from an unrelated case. A few days later,
that's our girl. Let's get her.
Police spot China Doll.
A warrant for your arrest.
Turn around, put your hands on your head.
Your warrant for questioning and a homicide, you're gonna have to come with us. Do you have any weapons on you or anything?
Let's go. Sit down.
We bring her in. We get the usual stone-faced appearance.
So, Donna.
My name is China Doll.
Right. Donna, why don't you tell me about the shooting?
I don't know anything.
How about Sonny Wright? You been having problems with him?
No.
China Doll tries to play tough, but Kenda sees right through it.
Without her gang present to protect her, she's a 19-year-old kid with a bad attitude. But that's all she is.
What's the problem with you and Sonny?
He made it up.
Sonny made this. I don't believe Sonny would make that up.
We've had a little run-in.
So you have had problems?
A little run-in.
China Doll admits she had words with Sonny and that her friends fired warning shots to scare him. But she claims the situation was resolved a few days later.
They were in a club where she tends to hang around with her friends. Sonny happened to be there, spoke to her, said he was sorry.
So you have no problems anymore?
We're good.
In her words, we were then cool.
China Doll's story has the ring of truth.
All right, sit tight.
And with zero evidence linking her to the crime, Kenda all but rules her out as a suspect. The investigation into Sharon Coleman's murder is back to square one.
Every murder case, it is a process. You chase somebody down a rabbit hole and you think this is a promising looking rabbit. And you interview, you interrogate, and it immediately falls apart in your hands. Okay, back to the source, Sonny.
Kenda needs to know if there's anyone else who might want Sonny or his girlfriend Sharon dead.
I come in, Sonny?
Yes.
I talked to China Doll. She said she's got no problems with you.
Right. Okay.
Right away, Kenda senses Sonny's hiding something.
Tell me what else you've been up to. Sonny initially says, I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do.
Well, I mean, this girl named Peaches.
And who's Peaches?
Peaches is like my other girlfriend.
You're what?
Sonny admits he'd been cheating on Sharon with a 17-year-old high school student known as Peaches. A week before the murder, the situation came to a head.
She came over here like not too long ago, and she was saying that she was pregnant.
Peaches had also apparently gotten wind of Sonny's other girlfriend.
For real, Sonny? For real? You supposed to be my man. Why you with this trick?
Because you crazy, that's
oh,
why.
Oh, no, I'm not crazy.
She said, you need to get rid of that girl and you need to be with me. She's got a gun in one hand and a chair leg in the other. She's really pissed, and Sharon comes out of his mother's apartment.
You still want to see Sharon for real?
Peaches stops threatening Sonny and begins to threaten Sharon.
You need to take your in the house. Bye, ho.
Sharon just turns around and goes inside.
She actually threatened to kill her.
Yes, sir.
I'm gonna kill you if you don't stay away from my man.
In the blink of an eye, Kenda has pinpointed a new prime suspect.
The old expression is true, hell hath no fury, and we have a pregnant woman scorned. Now that is a motive.
Sharon Coleman, a 22-year-old restaurant manager, was at an apartment complex with her boyfriend, Sonny Wright, when she was shot with an automatic rifle. Speaking to Sonny, Lt.Joe Kenda has learned of a young woman with motive to kill both of them.
Peaches is like my other girlfriend.
So you were dating her at the same time you were dating Sharon?
Yes, sir.
He stated that he did have some sexual encounters with her, and that she was stating that she was pregnant by him.
I need you to go home.
No, I ain't going nowhere. I will kill you and her.
There is no quicker way to get somebody enraged than to play with their emotions. Since he's not going to stand up and be dead, and he's got this other girl that she hates, how about if we get rid of both of them?
According to Sonny, Peaches had some dangerous friends. Could she have gotten others to do her dirty work?
So you know Sonny, that guy I've been seeing?
Who was that?
Well, he with this girl named Sharon.
It's not out of the realm of possibility that she could be mad and say, I want Sharon taken care of.
If I want to get rid of both of them, how could I go about doing that?
You know what you asked?
Yeah, you can do that.
Oh, we got you. You just make sure you keep your mouth shut.
Makes sense to me. This is human nature talking. So now our mission is to find her.
Within a matter of days, Kenda has convinced Peaches' mother to bring her down to the station.
The same stone-faced attitude.
Peaches, tell me what you know about Sharon's murder.
Who is Sharon? And why am I even here?
I'm a juvenile. You can't arrest me. You're right. We can't. Not yet, anyway.
Peaches, I'll throw your ass in prison.
My general interview strategy with a teenager like that is to instill in her some level of the fear of God.
If you know something, you need to tell me right now.
You'll be incarcerated in the El Paso County Jail, not in a juvenile detention center, and you're going to be in there with the big girls, Peaches. They're not going to be kids like you.
Look, I threatened Sharon, but I didn't have nothing to do with her murder.
Peaches admits she was jealous of Sharon, but swears she had no reason to want her dead.
She said she wasn't pregnant, and that she had never been pregnant by Sonny or by anybody else, and she just said that to get Sonny to commit to her as a boyfriend. When I discovered that she isn't pregnant, then that motive manages to evaporate.
What's more, Peaches claims she was actually at the apartment complex herself when the shooting happened.
Peaches did admit to being in the area, although she denies any knowledge of who or why the shots were fired.
Oh, how you want your hair done? Micros.
Oh yeah, that's gonna look right.
You going out tonight?
So there's people that will verify what happened?
Yeah, my homegirls.
All right. I need you to give me their names and numbers.
She identifies the people she's with that night. There were two other girls. We independently interviewed both of them. They confirm it. Peaches looked so good, and now she's just out.
Kenda is at a loss for why someone would shoot at Sharon and Sonny.
What am I missing? What am I not seeing in this case? This isn't working for me. I want to look at the car again. I go to the police lab. They still have the car in the garage. And I'm looking at the car. 2 holes.
More bullets impacted the apartments than they did the car.
And all of a sudden it hits me. This car is not the target. This car is in the way of the target. Sharon's not the intended victim, neither is Sonny. Somebody in that building is the intended victim.
Kenda has his men do a little digging and learns the apartment complex is reputed to be a hive of gang activity.
These are 81st Street Crips. They sell crack. What if they're part of this?
The 81st Street East Side Hustlers is an affiliate of the Crips, the infamous alliance of street gangs formed in South Central Los Angeles. In the 1980s, the Crips spread eastward in search of new markets to sell crack cocaine.
There is no 81st Street in Colorado Springs. We're talking 81st Street, Los Angeles, California. It is one of the original street gangs of the Crips who have franchised across the country.
The following morning, Kenda reaches out to his friends in the narcotics unit.
We get Metro Vice Narcotics to set up surveillance on this apartment. Surveillance for sale of narcotics is done by a group of different vehicles and different individuals. Some of them on foot, some of them on a bicycle, some of them in a car, some of them just driving by, to make it look as routine as possible. They also use very small electronic cameras to record people coming and going from a distance. All of that information establishes probable cause, search warrants are obtained, and then a raid is conducted. You want to play this game? We're good at this game. And our gang is better armed than your gang.
Lt.Joe Kenda is investigating the shooting death of Sharon Coleman, but he's come to believe that the trigger man was actually aiming for someone in the apartment building behind her. After learning that the 81st Street Crips sell crack out of one of the units, Kenda suspects they're somehow involved and asks the CSP narcotics team to conduct a raid.
What do you need? Give me a set. There. Lieutenant Kenda. Hallucinate these cops.
All right, let's get him out of here and start searching the place.
Keep your mouth shut.
Separate cars. Separate cars.
We drag all kinds of evidence out of this place, including handguns and ammunition, drugs, people, photographs.
A lot of pictures of individuals holding firearms, so that kind of piqued our interest.
Could one of these gang members have been the intended target of the shots that killed Sharon Coleman? Or is one of these gangsters the shooter? To answer that question, Kenda speaks with 17-year-old Amber Wright, who was nabbed in the raid.
If you help us out with this investigation, I could probably get the DA to go easier on the drug charges.
Man, I'm a juvenile. You can't take me to jail.
You're 17, you're chargeable as an adult, and we've elected to do precisely that.
Kenda presses Amber for information about the shooting.
Right now is the only chance you're gonna get to tell me who it is. So you need to start talking.
This produces the pressure necessary to elicit cooperation. She's willing now to be helpful.
We was all just chilling at my apartment. And then all of a sudden shooting started. We got scared.
The girls fled to the house of their friend Mike Wood, a fellow Crip.
We just got shot at.
They were over there because they were afraid to go home.
They just shot up the whole apartment. Right now, ain't nowhere in the world I'm going back.
No, we gotta chill out.
And this light-skinned black guy showed up, about 30 years old.
This man is a legend in the criminal underworld. Many know of him, but few have met him.
They call him Khaki. He's from Los Angeles. Really?
What's up, guys?
Khaki is a top-ranking lieutenant of the 81st Street Crips in LA.
He was somebody that people were afraid of and should have been because he was a violent person.
He told the girls that he's the one that shot up these buildings, but they were not the target of the gunfire, and that he apologized to them for scaring them and for hitting their apartment.
Sorry about your pants. Got a little trigger happy with some East Coast Crips.
Khaki explained that the East Coast Crips and the 81st Street Crips were at war. Some members of the East Coast faction had just moved into their apartment complex, and he wasn't going to stand for it.
But this is some stuff we gotta keep between us, you know what I'm saying? We gotta keep this on the low.
It's cool, cuz.
Along with Khaki's apology came a stern warning.
Khaki said, if we say anything, he'll kill us all. I believed him. He is one scary dude. When you consider that we have people who are involved in this gang life and routinely carry weapons, they speak reverently when they speak about Khaki. He is someone to be feared.
Have you seen Khaki since then?
No. He probably back at home. Probably went back to LA.
If Amber's story is true, then Sharon Coleman may be collateral damage.
This was a real break, and it gave us some real direction for us to focus our investigation on.
Kenda connects with the gang unit for more information on his new prime suspect.
Hey, afternoon, Lieutenant.
You got time to look something up for me real quick?
Sure, no problem. What do you need?
The guy goes by the street name of Khaki. Khaki.
Kenda and the gang officer search a moniker database for Los Angeles gang members.
I am showing something for an Anthony Charles Blevels.
Fantastic. Can you print that out for me?
Sure.
Khaki has multiple arrests in his file, but he's always managed to escape doing hard time.
He is a black male, 6 feet, 200 pounds. He is 30 years old. He is from Los Angeles.
So what you need?
Yep. I appreciate it. Thanks.
No problem, no problem.
Could the LAPD have the key to catching Kenda's man?
Yeah, I'm trying to find out some information on Anthony Blevels, a.k.a. Khaki. He's wanted for a homicide here in Colorado Springs.
It turns out they're very familiar with Kenda's suspect. He's a big player in the drug operations of the 81st Street Crips.
He is a guy who belongs to this gang, and he is sent to Colorado Springs to organize a subset of that gang, to sell drugs and send the money back to LA.
The LA detectives tell Kenda they have an informant who might lead him to Khaki.
We have an associate of his in custody right now, in jail. We think he might be helpful if there was a hint of maybe a reduced sentence.
I understand.
Well, my, Mr. Blevels. You and I are going to be talking about this.
Kenda hops the red-eye flight to Los Angeles. By morning, he's sitting across from the informant.
Can you tell me if you recognize anyone in these pictures? And who's that?
Man, that's Khaki.
Khaki being Anthony Blevels?
Yeah.
And you sure that's him?
Yeah.
He says Khaki calls him a week after the killing, before this person gets arrested, and says, oh man, I was shooting at some East Coast Crips and I smoked a...
The informant also related that Khaki was known to prefer the AK-47 as his weapon of choice.
Not only is the AK-47 a high-powered rifle, it uses the same type of bullet that killed Sharon Coleman.
At the point we get this information, there is no doubt in my mind that this is the guy.
There's just one problem.
You know where we can find Khaki?
Out in L.A. He left because of the heat.
The informant doesn't know where to find Khaki. He's disappeared into the shadows.
He knows we're looking for him. He knows what he's done.
What's more, the informant tells Kenda that Khaki uses multiple identities to throw law enforcement off his trail.
He's got driver's licenses. He's got all kinds of documents that say he's Anthony Charles Blevels. He has some that says he's Jude Hood. When I get this information, it really sets off the alarm bells. This guy's not just a street criminal. He's intelligent. He knows how to circumvent the system.
He knows so many people, man. He got so many connections. You ain't never gonna find him.
We'll see about that.
Lt.Joe Kenda is on the trail of an LA gang kingpin named Anthony Blevels, aka Jude Hood, aka Khaki. He believes Khaki was shooting at a rival gang in the apartment complex.
Get down! Get down!
And wound up mortally wounding Sharon Coleman in the process.
Everything we've learned all fit together like a glove. Khaki is our guy.
But Khaki seems to have vanished into thin air.
He intrigues me. This is why I got into this work in the first place. Now we have someone to pursue who is intelligent, who is concealing his trail, who has a number of identities. He's an extremely dangerous individual who considers what he does before he does it.
Kenda turns to the FBI for help finding Anthony Blevels.
He's wanted for homicide in Colorado Springs.
Days go by as police across the country keep an eye out for Khaki.
I didn't know if they had enough to catch that person. You know, I didn't hold out a lot of hope.
But just when it seems the case is slipping through Kenda's fingers,
this is Kenda,
a promising lead surfaces.
We get a phone call from the Louisiana State Police.
They had made a drug-related traffic stop.
Police seized 3 pounds of cocaine and multiple guns. The vehicle comes back registered to an Anthony Blevels, but it appears Mr. Blevels, aka Khaki, isn't among the men inside.
So whose guns and dope's that back there? Huh?
There are 3 people in this car. Nobody knows who Anthony Blevels is. Nobody knows nothing.
Just to be safe, Kenda asks Louisiana police to fax him the mugshots of all 3 men. The last one to come through is that of the driver.
I'm looking at that fax of Kevin Dondre Freeman. And there is Khaki looking at me from the photo. Well, Khaki, now we have another name. Who the hell are you? Well, one thing you are, Khaki, is you're under arrest.
Khaki is extradited to Colorado Springs. After months of pursuit, Kenda finally has his man.
I walk in and explain to him who I am, and somewhere between the lieutenant and the Kenda, Khaki tells me to stick it in my
We already know you did these shootings. We have all the evidence. We have the witnesses that put you there. This is your chance to tell me what happened.
No, bro. I want to speak with my lawyer.
If you're dealing with a hardened professional criminal, you're wasting your time trying to interrogate him. You're not going to get a word. Not a word.
Regardless, Kenda has a good idea of how the crime went down. Khaki was trying to intimidate the rival East Coast Crips.
I'm going to send some gunfire your way, and then I'm going to tell you about it later. And you continue to interfere with my business, and I'm going to get a little closer with this gun.
Get down! Get down!
And this girl and her boyfriend, who have nothing to do with this, happen to be in the way of the flying lead.
Khaki is charged with the murder of Sharon Coleman, but he still refuses to play ball.
Okay, fine. No statement then. In the meantime, you are in a little bit of a jam, aren't you? And that was the end of that conversation.
Khaki may be locked up, but Kenda's worried about the trial. Khaki has beaten the rap before. So far, the strongest evidence against him is his alleged confession to the informant in LA.
Conversation alone isn't going to get you very far. Juries make an assessment of conversation. But when you apply that conversation to physical evidence, then it becomes proof.
In search of this proof, Kenda re-examines the statement Amber Wright gave about meeting Khaki at Mike Wood's apartment just moments after the shooting.
Sorry about your past. Got a little trigger happy with East Coast Crips.
Why did Khaki visit Mike Wood's apartment after the shooting? Was it for help?
Between us.
To avoid serving hard time, Mike agrees to talk.
We explained to him the difficulties of him withholding information in a first-degree murder.
Well, Khaki came in, started talking to the girls. He grabbed me, took me outside.
After the shooting, Khaki gives me an AK-47.
This is the gun I used in the drive-by.
He says the cops don't know about him. They don't know about this gun.
All right, so what I need you to do is take care of this. I have no business, bro.
So what'd you do with it?
I scratched off the serial numbers and threw it in the reservoir.
Rampart Reservoir provides the drinking water for Colorado Springs. At over 100 feet deep and 13 miles around, recovering the rifle will be a challenge.
You know exactly where it is?
Yeah.
All right, we'll set it up.
Can the police department's dive team save the case?
They primarily are used in the recovery of dead bodies. They're believed to be in a body of water, either accidentally or through homicide. They on occasion are used to recover evidence.
4 days later, Kenda brings Mike to meet the dive team at Rampart Reservoir.
Our concern when we're recovering evidence is to make sure that whoever threw that item in the water, that we get that person on the shore to show us exactly where they stood when they threw that item in the water. We want to really limit our search as much as possible.
Mike uses a rock to point out the area where he threw the AK-47.
All right, guys.
And lead diver Sergeant Chuck Potter begins his descent to the bottom of the lake.
The detectives told us in our briefing that we were looking for the rifle barrel itself and also for the trigger mechanism.
Visibility is poor. Potter's team must feel their way, inch by inch, as they scour the bottom of the reservoir.
Sometimes it is so dark you can't see your depth gauge.
20 minutes pass, then 30.
A lot of times you have doubt. You don't know how reliable this guy was. He could be lying to us again. You don't know that. But you have to go out there and search anyway.
Finally, the dive team's diligence pays off.
I can just feel rocks, and all of a sudden I feel something very different. I determined, oh, this is a rifle barrel.
There it is. And it is a barrel from an AK-47. It's really significant to get some physical item that can't be explained away that is part of this case and is where this guy said he put it. It's the key piece of evidence.
The discovery of the AK prompts Anthony Blevels to change his tune. He pleads guilty to second-degree murder and is sentenced to 20 years in prison.
I think there's relief in the community that we have a police force that has the ability to take a very complicated case like this, to be able to do the legwork, to put these people behind bars.
But having Khaki locked up is of little consolation to Sharon Coleman's family.
She was killed for a little bit of power, and her life to me and a lot of people around her was priceless. I loved her to death, but she was average. Not powerful, high-profile, influential people, rich or anything like that. So Sharon's case could have gotten buried under a lot of paperwork, and it didn't. You know, Joe kept working it, and I appreciate what he's done.
She's in the wrong place at exactly the wrong time, and it results in her violent death. Khaki is indifferent to what he did. His attitude was, so what? Evil things are going on in this world. We all believe that if we're not part of that process, we will never suffer from that activity, from that evil. But evil is pervasive. In this particular case, evil finds Sharon.
The street was still asleep when the sound cut through the dark, too sharp to be a bird, too sudden to be the wind, just a single moment that didn't belong, hanging in the air before vanishing, the kind of moment people forget until they are asked later, until it matters, until it becomes the last sound anyone can remember hearing before Sydney changed. It was the year 2000, the city polished for a new millennium, fireworks still fresh in memory, optimism baked into the skyline, and somewhere between the harbor's quiet shimmer and the suburban sprawl beyond it, a person walked into the night and never came back. No body. No goodbye. No clean ending. Just absence, sudden and violent in its silence, like a door slammed shut in the middle of a sentence. By morning, the house was wrong. The kettle cold. The bed untouched. Shoes still by the door. A routine fractured by one missing detail that refused to explain itself. At first, it looked like nothing, no broken windows, no overturned furniture, no note left behind to soften the blow. The kind of disappearance that tricks you into believing it's temporary, that the person simply stepped out, got delayed, lost track of time. But hours stretched, calls went unanswered, and by the time the sun reached its highest point, the word missing was spoken aloud, heavy and irreversible. Neighbors gathered. Phones rang. A name echoed through hallways and across front lawns, growing louder with each repetition, until it reached the ears of police who had learned to recognize the difference between panic and certainty. Sydney had seen crime before. It had seen tragedy. But disappearances hit differently. They hollow out spaces. They turn familiar streets into question marks. The victim, because that's what they would eventually be called, was ordinary enough to be overlooked and familiar enough to be missed immediately. A face you'd pass at the corner shop. A voice you'd hear in passing conversation. Someone anchored to routines, to places, to people who could say, with uncomfortable confidence, that this wasn't a choice. This wasn't a vanishing act. This was a rupture. The first hours mattered most, or so the manuals said. Officers walked the route they were known to take, eyes scanning gutters, alleyways, bus stops. Dogs traced scents that tangled and faded. Cameras were scarce then, grainy where they existed, offering only fragments of movement without meaning. A shadow crossing a street. A figure turning a corner. Nothing that screamed danger. Nothing that explained the sudden erasure of a human life. The city kept moving, traffic flowing, ferries cutting across the water, while somewhere within it, a question took root and refused to be dislodged. How does someone disappear without a trace? The community felt it immediately. Shops pinned flyers to windows. Radio hosts read out descriptions between songs. The face became familiar in a new, unsettling way, flattened into ink and paper, frozen in time. Every reported sighting sparked a jolt of hope, followed by the dull ache of disappointment. A person who looked similar. A memory recalled too late. Each false lead left behind a residue of frustration, building a sense that the case was slipping, inch by inch, beyond reach. Investigators worked the angles they always worked. Family first. Friends next. The routine questions, the careful listening for inconsistencies. Where were you last night? When did you see them last? Was anything different? Answers came easily, too easily, delivered with the exhaustion of people who had nothing to hide and everything to lose. No obvious enemies. No debts. No whispered threats that could anchor suspicion. The life left behind was painfully normal, which made the disappearance feel obscene, like a crime committed against logic itself. As days turned into weeks, the language shifted. Urgency cooled into procedure. Search grids were redrawn. Resources reallocated. Other cases pressed in, louder, bloodier, easier to explain. The disappearance was still open, still active, but it began to drift toward a colder category, the kind that lives in filing cabinets and late-night conversations, the kind detectives carry with them long after the public stops asking questions. The city's attention moved on, as cities always do, but for those closest to the center of the storm, time stalled completely. Rumors filled the vacuum left by facts. A stranger seen lurking. A car idling too long at the curb. A fight overheard, its details reshaped with each retelling. None of it solid enough to hold. None of it strong enough to turn into charges or closures. The absence grew heavier, pressing down on birthdays, holidays, ordinary mornings that now came with a companion shadow. Grief without a body is a special kind of torment. It refuses to settle. It keeps asking questions long after the answers stop coming. Years passed, marked not by progress, but by anniversaries. The case file thickened with paper, but thinned of hope. New detectives read old notes, trying to hear urgency in words written decades earlier. Technology advanced. Databases expanded. Old evidence was re-examined, scanned, cross-referenced, each pass offering the same quiet verdict, inconclusive. Sydney changed around the mystery. Buildings rose. Streets were renamed. The city aged, but the disappearance stayed young, preserved in the moment it began, untouched by resolution. Every so often, something stirred. A tip phoned in from someone halfway across the country. A name resurfacing in an unrelated investigation. A rumor dragged into the light and dissected under scrutiny until it fell apart. Each time, the pulse quickened. Each time, it slowed again. The case earned a label that sounded almost clinical, almost gentle, but carried enormous weight: cold case. Two words that meant time had done its damage, that whatever answers existed were now buried under years of forgetfulness, fear, and chance. And yet, it never truly went away. It lingered in the background noise of the city, a low-frequency hum of unresolved loss. Detectives mentioned it in training rooms. Journalists referenced it when talking about mysteries that refused to die. It became shorthand for a question Sydney couldn't answer about itself. How could someone vanish here, in a city so vast and yet so closely watched, without leaving behind a trail? The house where it began changed hands. New occupants painted walls, rearranged furniture, lived their lives unaware of the weight that once settled there. But some places remember. Some streets carry echoes that don't fade. Late at night, when traffic thins and the city exhales, the disappearance still feels close, like it could happen again, like it never really stopped happening at all. The title that would one day be attached to the case, Sydney 2000 Disappearance Resolved, didn't exist yet. Back then, there was only uncertainty, only the slow, grinding realization that the truth might be gone for good. Investigators closed their notebooks at the end of long days with no arrests to show for it. Families went to sleep with phones by their beds, listening for calls that never came. The city learned how to live around a hole it couldn't fill. And beneath it all, untouched by time, the central question waited, sharp and unyielding, refusing to soften with age. What really happened on that quiet night, and why, after all these years, does the answer still feel just out of reach? By the time the first press conference ended, the questions were already louder than the answers. Reporters clustered behind yellow tape as officers repeated the same careful phrases. No sign of forced entry, no immediate suspects, investigation ongoing, and with every word the gap between what was known and what was feared stretched wider, filling the air with a tension that didn't dissipate when the cameras shut off. Inside the station, the case was pinned to a board with red string and handwritten notes, a constellation of small, ordinary details struggling to form a picture that made sense, a life reduced to timestamps and locations, habits and routines that suddenly felt like clues rather than comforts. They reconstructed the last confirmed hours with forensic patients, minute by minute, phone calls logged, receipts examined, movements traced through memory rather than machines, because in 2000 the city didn't watch itself the way it would later, and what emerged was maddening in its normality. A stop at a familiar place. A conversation that ended without tension. A walk taken dozens of times before. Nothing sharp enough to cut a hole in the night, nothing dramatic enough to explain why that walk never reached its destination. The absence of drama became its own provocation, daring investigators to find meaning where there seemed to be none. Witnesses were interviewed, then re-interviewed, then interviewed again months later when the same questions carried a different weight. Someone thought they heard raised voices. Someone else recalled a car moving too fast down a quiet street. Memories shifted, blurred by repetition and the subtle pressure to be helpful, to contribute something that mattered. The police wrote it all down anyway, because in a case like this even the smallest detail could someday turn heavy enough to break it open. The neighborhood changed its behavior without ever discussing it out loud. Doors locked earlier. Porch lights stayed on longer. Parents watched their children cross streets with a new intensity. The disappearance had punctured an unspoken sense of safety, the belief that bad things happened elsewhere, to other people, in darker places. This was different. This had happened here, under familiar streetlights, and it suggested a vulnerability no one had been prepared to face. Detectives followed leads that went nowhere, chasing names that dissolved under scrutiny, alibis that held just long enough to deflate suspicion. They knocked on doors at odd hours, flipped through old notebooks, tried to read between lines written years before by colleagues who had since retired or moved on. Every investigator brought their own theory to the table: abduction by a stranger, a crime of opportunity, something planned but invisible, and each theory collapsed under the same stubborn fact: there was nothing solid to hold it up. The case file grew heavier, its physical weight mirroring the emotional burden it carried. Inside were photographs that never changed, statements frozen in time, maps marked with circles that meant nothing on their own. Every so often, a new page was added, a tip logged, a possibility entertained, but the spine of the story remained the same: a beginning without a middle, an opening act that refused to progress. For the family, time fractured. Life continued because it had to, but every ordinary moment came with an asterisk, every decision shadowed by the question of absence. They learned the language of police work, the rhythms of hope and disappointment, the way a ringing phone could lift the heart and sink it again in the same breath. Public attention faded, but private vigilance sharpened. They noticed things others missed, stored away fragments of information like talismans against forgetting. Years slid by almost unnoticed, measured not in progress, but in repetition. Annual appeals were made, faces older now, voices steadier, asking the same questions into the same void. Advances in technology promised new possibilities, DNA databases expanding, forensic techniques sharpening, but without evidence to test, without something tangible to re-examine, progress remained theoretical. The case hovered in a limbo that felt permanent. Every cold case has a moment when it officially cools, when resources are quietly redirected and urgency is replaced with maintenance, and when that moment arrived here, it didn't come with an announcement. It came with fewer calls returned, longer gaps between updates, a subtle shift in tone that said everything without spelling it out. The investigation wasn't closed, but it was no longer burning. It smoldered, waiting for oxygen. Occasionally, a story in the news would stir it back to life. Another disappearance. Another body found years later. Another confession that rewrote a timeline everyone thought they understood. Each time, the case was pulled back into the light, dusted off, compared against new patterns, only to be set down again when the similarities failed to line up. Hope became cautious, almost restrained, learned behavior shaped by too many false alarms. The city's memory of the event transformed over time, from immediate shock to distant unease. New residents learned about it the way people learn about local legends, through half-finished anecdotes and casual references, a mystery that belonged to the place as much as its landmarks. For those who had been there at the beginning, though, the memory remained sharp, the initial fear preserved in amber, unchanged by repetition. Detectives retired, taking with them instincts and impressions that never made it into official reports. New investigators inherited the file, reading between the lines, trying to feel the urgency their predecessors had felt when the trail was fresh. They walked the same streets, now altered by time, searching for angles that hadn't existed before. Sometimes they found something small, a discrepancy, a name that seemed out of place, and for a moment the case felt alive again, responsive, as if it might finally yield. But the mystery resisted resolution with a quiet persistence. No confessions surfaced. No remains were discovered. The disappearance stayed complete, total, an erasure so thorough it bordered on the uncanny. It challenged assumptions about visibility, about how much a city truly sees of itself, about the thin line between presence and absence. Late at night, detectives sometimes returned to the beginning, replaying that first morning, the cold kettle, the untouched bed, the way certainty had arrived not as a scream, but as a slow, creeping realization. They wondered what they'd missed, what detail had seemed irrelevant at the time, but might have changed everything if viewed through a different lens. Regret is an occupational hazard in cases like this, a constant companion that asks questions with no answers. The file acquired a reputation, spoken about in hushed tones, a benchmark against which other unsolved cases were measured. It became an example, a cautionary tale, a reminder of limits. Training sessions referenced it. Journalists circled it whenever anniversaries came around. The word Sydney disappearance carried weight, shorthand for a failure that no one wanted to own, but everyone felt. And still, the city moved forward, layered new stories over old ones, until the night of the disappearance felt like a fault line buried deep beneath the surface, invisible, but capable of shifting everything if pressed the right way. Somewhere, someone knew something. That belief persisted not because it was comforting, but because the alternative was unbearable. As the years stacked up, the question changed shape. It was no longer just about what happened, but about why it had remained hidden for so long, what kind of truth could survive untouched by time, waiting patiently while lives rearranged themselves around a missing center. The case was unresolved, officially and emotionally, its gravity undiminished by age. And in that unresolved space, the tension lingered, taut and expectant, as if the story itself were holding its breath, waiting for the moment when silence would finally give way to sound again. Time did what time always does in unsolved cases. It rearranged priorities, softened outrage into something quieter and more corrosive, and yet it also sharpened certain edges, turning small unanswered questions into obsessions that refused to dull. Somewhere in the second decade after the disappearance, when the case had already outlived initial investigators and most public memory, a different kind of attention settled over it, slower, more deliberate, less interested in spectacle and more attuned to patterns that only emerge when years are laid on top of each other like transparent sheets. What once looked empty began to show faint outlines, shapes that had been invisible when everything was too close, too loud, too raw. A new detective took the file home one night, not officially, not with permission, just out of a restlessness that refused to turn off at the end of a shift. The pages smelled old, edges yellowed, corners bent by hands that had turned them with hope and then with resignation. Reading it outside the office changed something. Without the background noise of ringing phones and competing priorities, the story slowed down, and in that slowness, inconsistencies began to whisper. Not contradictions exactly, but gaps. Pauses. Moments where the narrative jumped forward without fully accounting for what had been left behind. The last confirmed sighting, for instance, had always been treated as an anchor point, solid and unquestioned. But when the detective mapped it against later statements, against updated timelines reconstructed years later, the anchor shifted slightly. Not enough to cause alarm, not enough to invalidate anything outright, but enough to suggest that certainty had been built on recollection rather than proof. Memory, the most unreliable witness of all, had been allowed to harden into fact. There were also names in the file that appeared once and never again, mentioned in passing, dismissed without ceremony. People on the periphery, acquaintances rather than friends, familiar faces rather than close confidants. In the chaos of the early days, they hadn't stood out, hadn't demanded attention. Now, viewed through the lens of distance, their absence from follow-up felt louder than their initial presence. Why had no one gone back? Why had these threads been dropped so quickly? The detective began quietly, rechecking details without reopening wounds, making calls framed as routine, questions posed as clarification rather than suspicion. Some numbers no longer worked. Some addresses led to different occupants. Lives had moved on, scattered, reshaped. But a few voices answered, surprised to be asked, hesitant at first, then cautiously cooperative. Time had softened loyalties, loosened tongues. What had once felt too close, too dangerous to discuss, now felt like ancient history. Stories emerged that hadn't made it into the original reports. Small tensions. Minor arguments. A sense, recalled vaguely, that something had been off in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, not dramatic enough to raise alarms at the time, but persistent enough to be remembered now. None of it was explosive. None of it screamed motive. But together, these fragments began to suggest a context that had never been fully explored, a background hum of unease that had gone unrecorded. Technology, too, had changed the rules. Old phone records, once impossible to retrieve, were now accessible through archived systems. Financial transactions, once summarized, could be reconstructed in detail. Data that had been considered lost was suddenly available, waiting only for someone to ask the right way. The detective cross-referenced timelines with new precision, aligning calls, movements, purchases, building a version of events more granular than anything the original investigation had managed. What emerged was not a clear answer, but a narrowing of possibility. Certain theories lost ground. Others gained weight. The idea of a random act, once appealing in its simplicity, began to feel less convincing. Too many coincidences stacked up, too many moments where chance would have had to work overtime to explain what happened. The disappearance started to look less like an accident of fate and more like an intersection of choices, deliberate, or otherwise, converging at exactly the wrong moment. The file was reopened, quietly at first, without fanfare or press releases. Officially, it had never been closed, but this was different. This was active. Resources were modest, carefully justified, but the tone shifted. Meetings resumed. Whiteboards filled with updated timelines. Younger officers listened as veterans recounted early impressions that hadn't made it into reports, because they hadn't seemed important then. Intuition, long discounted, was invited back into the room. One detail, long overlooked, began to stand out. A brief window of time that had never been fully accounted for, a gap small enough to dismiss, but large enough to matter. In the original chaos, it had been smoothed over, assumptions made to keep the story moving. Now it was circled and read, isolated, examined from every angle. What could happen in that window? Who could have been there? What opportunities did it create? Revisiting the physical environment added another layer. Streets had changed, but not entirely. Some sight lines remained. Some blind spots were still blind. Standing there again, imagining the night as it had been, without the benefit of hindsight, the detective felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The space made sense in a way the file never had. It suggested movement. Proximity. The possibility of observation without being seen. Attention turned to people who had been nearby, geographically if not emotionally. Individuals whose routines intersected briefly, incidentally, with the victim's final hours. Back then, they'd been background noise. Now they were points of interest. Not suspects yet, not even persons of concern, just names elevated from the margins to the center of the board. With that elevation came scrutiny, careful and methodical. One name, in particular, resisted easy categorization. It appeared in several contexts, none of them incriminating on their own. A casual acquaintance. A witness who hadn't seen anything. A neighbor who'd heard nothing. The kind of person investigators are trained to move past quickly. And yet, when their statements were laid side by side, a subtle evolution emerged. Details shifted. Emphases changed. Not lies exactly, but adjustments, as if the story were being tuned over time to fit what was believed to be known. The detective didn't confront them outright. Not yet. Pressure too early can collapse a fragile structure. Instead, the approach was indirect, gathering corroboration, testing memories against external records. Where had they been, really? Who could confirm it? What devices did they have access to in an era before smartphones tracked every movement? The answers were unsatisfying, murky, bounded by the limitations of the time. But they were no longer taken at face value. As the reopened investigation gained quiet momentum, resistance surfaced in subtle ways. Files that took too long to retrieve. Requests that moved slowly through bureaucratic channels. A sense that some people preferred the past to remain undisturbed. Cold cases have a way of implicating more than just perpetrators. They expose missed opportunities, flawed assumptions, decisions made under pressure that look different decades later. Not everyone welcomes that exposure. Still, the work continued. Interviews were conducted with care, trauma-informed but persistent. Old evidence was tested again, not because new results were expected, but because leaving no stone unturned had become a principle rather than a slogan. Each negative result narrowed the field further, funneling attention toward the few remaining unknowns. The family was informed, cautiously, their expectations managed with practiced empathy. They had lived through cycles of hope before, learned to temper excitement with skepticism. Even so, something about this felt different. The questions were sharper. The focus more precise. For the first time in years, updates contained substance rather than reassurance. The past, long frozen, seemed to be moving again, Media interest flickered back to life, tentative at first. Anniversary pieces mentioned new developments, careful not to promise too much. The city responded with a muted curiosity, older residents recalling where they'd been when the news first broke, younger ones encountering the story as if for the first time. The disappearance slipped back into conversation, no longer as legend but as an active question. And yet, for all the renewed energy, certainty remained elusive. Every step forward revealed new complexity. Every potential breakthrough came with caveats. The case resisted clean lines, refused to resolve into a single, satisfying narrative. It demanded patience, humility, a willingness to sit with ambiguity longer than anyone wanted to. Late one evening, alone again with the file, the detective paused on a photograph that had been there from the beginning, unremarkable at first glance. This time, they noticed what had been cropped out, what lay just beyond the frame. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even a clue in the traditional sense. But it suggested perspective, a reminder that every investigation is shaped by what it chooses to see and what it leaves unseen. The disappearance was no longer just a relic of the past. It was active, breathing, reshaping itself in the present. The silence that had defined it for so long was beginning to crack, not with a dramatic confession or a sudden discovery, but with the slow, deliberate pressure of attention applied in the right places. Somewhere within that pressure, the truth waited, patient and unmoved by time, ready to surface only when the story around it had been stripped of assumptions and distractions. And as the investigation pushed forward, one thing became increasingly clear. Whatever had happened that night was not as unknowable as it once seemed, and the years of quiet had not erased it, only hidden it more carefully, waiting for someone willing to look again. Pressure changes behavior, even when it's applied gently, and as the reopened investigation settled into its rhythm, that pressure began to seep outward, touching people who hadn't thought about the disappearance in years, people who had built entire lives on the assumption that the past was finished with them. Phone calls came out of the blue. Names long dormant were spoken again, carefully, politely, but with an edge that made it clear this wasn't nostalgia. This was unfinished business. The person whose name had lingered at the edge of the file felt it first. Nothing dramatic. No knock at the door in the middle of the night. Just a request to talk. A casual tone. A suggestion of clarification. On the surface, it was routine, but beneath it ran an unmistakable current. We are looking again, and this time we are looking closer. Their reaction was controlled, measured, almost helpful, but control itself can be a signal. People who have nothing to hide rarely manage their responses so carefully. Interviews stretched longer than planned. Questions looped back on themselves, testing consistency rather than seeking new information. The past was revisited in detail, not to trap, but to observe. Where did your eyes go when that date was mentioned? How quickly did you answer when that name came up? What did you avoid saying when silence would have been easier? None of it was admissible. All of it was instructive. Meanwhile, the timeline was rebuilt again, this time with a level of granularity that bordered on obsession. Minutes mattered. Gaps were interrogated. Assumptions were stripped away and replaced with conditional language. If this happened, then what follows? If that memory is wrong, what changes? The investigation became less about proving a theory and more about stress-testing reality itself, asking how many versions of events could exist before only one remained standing. One long-ignored detail resurfaced with new significance, a routine interaction that had seemed too banal to matter at the time. It involved no argument, no raised voices, no witnesses who could point to a clear moment of danger. Just proximity. Just opportunity. In hindsight, it stood out precisely because it had blended in so well. Crimes that hide in plain sight often do so by borrowing the shapes of everyday life. The detectives revisited physical evidence that had been boxed up and shelved, items so unremarkable they had barely earned a second glance. Clothing fibers. Trace materials. Objects that told no story on their own. Advances in forensic science had turned once useless fragments into potential narrators, capable of whispering truths if asked the right way. Tests were ordered, results awaited, not with expectation, but with a quiet determination to exhaust every possibility. Some results came back negative. Others came back ambiguous, suggestive but not definitive. In a different kind of case, they might have been dismissed. Here, they were catalogued, led into the growing mosaic of probability. Certainty remained elusive, but the range of uncertainty narrowed. The story was becoming less infinite, less forgiving. As word of the renewed effort spread, so did discomfort. Old relationships were re-examined. Casual conversations took on a defensive edge. People compared notes without realizing they were doing it, trying to remember what they had said years ago, trying to align their memories with a version of events that now felt dangerously fluid. Memory, once a refuge, became a liability. The family watched from a careful distance. They had learned to read between the lines of official updates, to sense when momentum was real and when it was cosmetic. This time, the changes were subtle but unmistakable. Names were mentioned that hadn't been mentioned before. Questions were more specific. Silence, when it occurred, felt strategic rather than empty. Hope crept back in, unwelcome and unavoidable. The city, too, responded in its own way. Old headlines resurfaced online, shared by people who had barely been adults when the disappearance first occurred. Comment sections filled with speculation, half-remembered rumors, theories shaped by hindsight and imagination. Most of it was noise. Some of it echoed things investigators had already noted privately. The past has a way of leaking into public consciousness when it senses it might finally be understood. Behind closed doors, debates flared. Was the evidence strong enough to justify escalation? Was it too early to confront directly, too risky to show their hand? Cold cases punish impatience. Move too fast and you alert someone who has survived on silence. Move too slow and the opportunity evaporates. The balance is delicate, and everyone in the room felt the weight of getting it wrong. The person at the center of renewed attention began to feel the shift. Friends noticed changes, restlessness, a shortness of temper that hadn't been there before. Small habits altered. Routines adjusted. None of it illegal. None of it overt. But patterns, once disrupted, rarely returned to their original shape unnoticed. Surveillance, where permitted, confirmed the sense of unease. Something was happening beneath the surface. Another interview was scheduled, this one longer, more pointed. This time, records were introduced, not as accusations, but as reference points. Phone logs. Old receipts. Gaps that required explanation. The room stayed calm. Voices stayed low. The questions came like steady drops of water, not enough to overwhelm, but enough to erode. Answers were given. Some matched. Some slid sideways, technically accurate, but emotionally evasive. Afterward, the detectives didn't celebrate or despair. They returned to the board and adjusted it again, moving pieces slightly, refining angles. The case wasn't solved. It wasn't even close. But it was no longer static. It was responding, reacting, revealing its contours under sustained attention. The silence that had defined it for so long was being replaced by something else, a tension that suggested resistance. Late one night, a call came in from an unexpected source. Not a confession. Not a tip from a stranger. Just a person who had been close enough to see something years ago, and far enough away now to say it out loud. The information was fragmentary, hedged with uncertainty, but it pointed in a direction investigators had been circling without fully committing to. It didn't answer the central question. It reframed it. The next steps were careful, almost surgical. Paperwork. Approvals. Quiet coordination between departments. No leaks. No public statements. The kind of preparation that looks like inactivity from the outside, but feels like acceleration from within. Everyone involved understood the stakes. This was the point where cases either break open or retreat deeper into shadow. As dawn crept over the city, casting familiar streets in a light that felt both ordinary and newly charged, the investigation stood at a threshold. Years of absence, of unanswered questions, of lives lived around a missing center had led here, to a moment defined not by certainty, but by possibility sharpened into focus. The disappearance was still unresolved. The title that would one day rewrite its history still felt premature, almost arrogant. But beneath the caution, beneath the discipline, something unmistakable was stirring. The past, long silent, was beginning to push back, and in that resistance lay the first real hint that it might finally be forced to speak. Momentum is a fragile thing in cold cases, built slowly and lost easily, and everyone involved felt how carefully it had to be handled now, as if the investigation itself might shatter if moved too abruptly. The new information was pinned to the board without ceremony, no bold marker or dramatic annotation, just another note among many, but its presence altered the balance of the room. Conversations leaned toward it. Eyes returned to it. It didn't scream answers, but it hummed with implication. The source of the late-night call was interviewed again, this time in person, their words unfolding with the halting rhythm of someone reaching back through decades of memory, unsure of what mattered and what didn't. They spoke about a moment that had felt insignificant at the time, a brief interaction, a look exchanged, a sense of tension that hadn't risen to the level of alarm. Back then, it had been easy to rationalize, to assume it was nothing. Now, framed by everything that followed, it felt heavier, like a footnote that belonged in the main text all along. Investigators didn't push for certainty. They let the uncertainty breathe. Cold cases don't reward pressure in the same way fresh ones do. Instead, they listened, asking the same question in slightly different ways, letting the story settle into its most honest shape. When the interview ended, there was no dramatic silence, no shared glance of triumph. Just a quiet acknowledgement that another piece had been added, imperfect but necessary. The focus narrowed again, not to a single person, but to a cluster of overlapping lives, a small ecosystem of routines and relationships that intersected more tightly than anyone had realized at the time. The disappearance no longer floated free of context. It was anchored now, not by proof, but by plausibility. The question was no longer how someone could vanish without a trace, but how the trace had been overlooked for so long. Surveillance records, where they existed, were re-examined with this new lens. Not the obvious footage, not the moments investigators had already dissected to exhaustion, but the margins, the background movements, the figures who passed through frames without drawing attention. In one grainy sequence, a familiar shape appeared and disappeared again, too indistinct to identify, too brief to confirm. On its own, it meant nothing. Paired with the emerging timeline, it became suggestive, another quiet nudge rather than a revelation. The person who had become central to the investigation sensed the shift, even if they couldn't articulate it. The casual confidence that had carried them through earlier interviews eroded slightly, replaced by something tighter, more guarded. Conversations grew shorter. Answers arrived faster, as if speed could substitute for substance. Detectives noted it all without comment, understanding that behavior often tells its story before evidence does. Behind the scenes, legal considerations entered the conversation. How much was enough to justify stronger measures? Where was the line between suspicion and proof? Cold cases are constrained not just by time, but by the standards that govern accountability. The past doesn't get a lower bar. If anything, it demands a higher one. Every step had to be defensible, every inference supported by something more than instinct. For the family, the waiting took on a new texture. They were no longer suspended in the same shapeless uncertainty. Updates, though still careful, carried weight. Names were spoken that had never been spoken before. Possibilities were acknowledged, not dismissed. It was both a relief and a new kind of burden. Hope, once reintroduced, is harder to manage than despair. It asks for patience and restraint at the same time. The media caught fragments of the change, sensing movement without understanding its shape. Articles referenced renewed focus, and persons of interest, careful not to overstate. Commentators speculated, filling airtime with theories that ranged from insightful to reckless. Investigators ignored most of it, aware that public noise can contaminate fragile progress. Still, they couldn't entirely control the narrative. The story was out there again, alive and unsettled. Within the investigative team, tension sharpened. Opinions diverged. Some argued it was time to confront directly, to apply pressure, and see what broke. Others urged caution, pointing to the thinness of the evidence, the risk of forcing a retreat rather than a breakthrough. The debate wasn't academic. It was about timing, about reading the psychology of someone who had lived for years believing they were beyond reach. They chose patience, for now. Instead of escalation, they widened the net just enough to test its strength. Secondary interviews were conducted, not with the intensity of interrogations, but with the persistence of people who refused to let details slide. Old acquaintances were asked to recall dynamics they had never thought mattered. Some resisted. Some surprised themselves by remembering more than they expected. Time had a way of loosening truths once held tight by fear or loyalty. Patterns emerged, not clean lines, but clusters of similarity. People described the same moods, the same subtle changes in behavior leading up to the disappearance. Nothing that screamed violence. Everything that whispered instability. The picture that formed was unsettling precisely because it was so mundane. No mastermind. No elaborate scheme. Just a convergence of circumstance and choice, amplified by secrecy. The investigation revisited the possibility of a scene that had never been officially designated as one. A place that had been passed through, dismissed, cleaned, repurposed. Forensic opportunities there were limited, compromised by time and use. Still, the area was examined again, not for what it could definitively prove, but for what it might reasonably suggest. Absence, in this context, was also data. Results trickled in slowly, each one a small adjustment rather than a dramatic swing. Some avenues closed. Others narrowed. The range of viable explanations continued to shrink. What remained was uncomfortable, implicating someone whose ordinariness had once shielded them from scrutiny. The idea that something so final could emerge from something so familiar unsettled everyone involved. The person under scrutiny requested a lawyer for the first time. It was their right. It was also a signal. The shift was noted, not celebrated. Legal counsel changes the texture of an investigation, formalizing what had previously been exploratory. Words become deliberate. Silence becomes strategic. The space for spontaneous error narrows. Investigators adapted, recalibrating their approach. They leaned more heavily on corroboration, on records that couldn't be coached or forgotten. Financial data. Employment logs. Travel histories reconstructed from fragments. Each dataset told a partial story. Together, they began to overlap in ways that were difficult to ignore. Still, the central question remained unanswered. No confession. No physical proof that could anchor charges. The disappearance hovered between understanding and resolution, its shape clearer now, but its substance still elusive. The risk of stagnation loomed, the danger that momentum would bleed away into frustration. Then, unexpectedly, something shifted from the inside. A person connected tangentially to the emerging narrative reached out, not to police directly, but to someone they trusted, someone who understood the weight of what they were about to say. The message was hesitant, framed as concern rather than accusation, but it carried a detail that had never surfaced before, a detail that intersected precisely with the investigation's most fragile hypothesis. When it reached detectives, it was handled with care bordering on reverence. This was the kind of information that could change everything or collapse under scrutiny. Verification began immediately, quietly, relentlessly. Records were checked. Timelines adjusted. For the first time, multiple independent strands aligned without forcing. The room felt different after that. Not triumphant. Focused. Conversations shortened, sharpened. Tasks were assigned with clarity. The sense of circling gave way to a sense of direction. The case was still unsolved, still officially a disappearance, but the fog that had surrounded it for decades was thinning. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the subtle recalibration happening in offices and interview rooms. People walked the same streets where the disappearance had begun, living lives shaped by routines and assumptions that felt solid and safe. Few knew how close the past was to intruding again, how near the story was to shedding its long silence. As night fell, investigators reviewed their notes one more time, aware that the next steps would be decisive. There was no room now for speculative wandering. Whatever had happened back then was coming into focus, not as a sudden revelation, but as an accumulation of truths that had waited patiently for the right moment to converge. The disappearance had not been erased by time. It had been preserved, intact beneath layers of distraction and denial. And now, as those layers peeled away, what remained was no longer a mystery defined by absence, but one defined by the growing weight of what was finally being seen. The shift was subtle but undeniable, like a change in air pressure before a storm, and everyone in the room felt it without needing to name it. The investigation had crossed an invisible line, moving from exploration into consequence, from asking what might have happened to preparing for what it would mean if they were right. Files were reorganized. Language tightened. Hypotheses hardened into working theories, no longer floated tentatively, but tested with intent. The new detail, the one that had arrived quietly, almost apologetically, refused to fade under scrutiny. It held up when aligned with records. It fit when pressed against timelines that had once seemed immovable. It didn't answer everything, but it explained enough to destabilize years of assumption. For the first time, the disappearance had a gravity that pulled toward a specific center rather than radiating outward in all directions. Detectives reconstructed the night again, this time with the emerging theory as a guide rather than a destination. They traced movements not as isolated events, but as interactions, moments where paths crossed briefly and meaningfully. The city, once an overwhelming expanse, shrank to a handful of streets, a few critical windows of time. What had felt impossible before now felt disturbingly plausible. Attention turned to logistics. If the theory held, then certain actions would have been necessary. Certain choices unavoidable. They asked themselves not just who, but how. How could someone act without drawing attention? How could evidence vanish so completely? The answers weren't cinematic. They were practical, almost mundane. Opportunity paired with familiarity. Knowledge of routines. Access without suspicion. The most unsettling crimes rarely announce themselves. A search warrant was discussed, drafted, redrafted. The threshold was high. Years had passed. Places had changed. The risk of finding nothing loomed large. But the risk of not looking at all was worse. Legal teams combed through affidavits, ensuring every claim was anchored to something tangible, every inference supported by more than intuition. When the warrant was finally approved, it arrived not as a triumph, but as a responsibility. The location, when named, carried a quiet shock. It was not remote. Not hidden. It was a place many had passed without a second glance, woven into the fabric of ordinary life. That ordinariness had protected it, allowed it to exist unchallenged while the mystery aged around it. Standing outside it now, years later, investigators felt the dissonance keenly. If something had happened here, it had happened in plain sight. The search was methodical, restrained by the realities of time and use. Floors had been replaced. Walls repainted. Landscapes altered. Whatever physical truth remained was likely fragmented, compromised. Still, teams worked carefully, documenting everything, treating absence itself as information. They knew better than to expect a dramatic discovery. Cold cases rarely reward hope with spectacle. What they found, instead, were hints. Disturbances inconsistent with recorded renovations. Trace elements that shouldn't have been there. Nothing definitive. Nothing that could stand alone in court. But enough to reinforce the direction they were moving in, enough to justify the next step. The person at the center of the investigation was informed, formally this time, that they were no longer being spoken to as a witness. The words were precise, stripped of accusation, but heavy with implication. Their reaction was muted, controlled to the point of rigidity. No outburst. No denial. Just a tightening, as if something internal had finally snapped into place. Interviews that followed were conducted under a different set of rules. Lawyers present. Questions carefully phrased. Silence employed strategically. Detectives listened more than they spoke, watching for cracks in composure, moments when rehearsed narratives faltered under their own weight. It wasn't about eliciting a confession. It was about documenting behavior, preserving a record of how someone responded when the ground shifted beneath them. Meanwhile, corroboration continued quietly. People who had once dismissed their own memories as unreliable were asked again, this time with context that sharpened recollection. Some details grew clearer. Others dissolved. A few stood firm, resistant to erosion. When independent accounts aligned, even imperfectly, they were treated as anchors in a sea of uncertainty. The family was brought in, not for answers, but for honesty. Investigators explained where things stood, what could be said and what couldn't, what remained unknown and what had changed. It was a conversation heavy with restraint, careful not to promise what might never materialize. The family listened, absorbing the implications with a mixture of relief and dread. Knowing more did not make the waiting easier. It made it sharper. Outside the investigation, rumors began to circulate again, fueled by visible police activity and the quiet withdrawal of someone once seen as peripheral. The media pressed for confirmation, for labels, for declarations. None were given. The case had survived this long by resisting simplification. It would not be undone now by premature exposure. Internally, the team grappled with the possibility that resolution might still be incomplete. Even if responsibility could be established, even if charges could be considered, the disappearance might never yield all its secrets. There might be no definitive account of final moments, no remains to recover, no single piece of evidence that silenced doubt. Justice, in this context, would be partial, shaped by probability rather than certainty. That reality weighed heavily, especially on those who had been there from the beginning. They revisited early decisions with fresh eyes, seeing not negligence, but limitation, not failure but constraint. The past could not be rewritten. It could only be understood more fully. Acceptance of that truth was as necessary as any legal outcome. As days blurred into long, focused hours, the investigation pressed forward, guided now by a clarity that had been absent for decades. The disappearance was no longer an abstract puzzle. It was a human story with edges sharp enough to cut, implications real enough to demand accountability. And yet, beneath the progress, beneath the sense of nearing something final, the case retained its core tension. The title that hovered over it, Sydney 2000 Disappearance Resolved, still felt aspirational, almost defiant. Resolution was a horizon, visible, but not yet reached, promising answers while withholding them. Late one evening, after most of the building had emptied, a detective sat alone with the file, flipping through pages that no longer felt inert. They paused on the earliest entries, the frantic notes from the first days, the certainty that answers would come quickly. The distance between then and now felt immense, measured not just in years, but in understanding. What struck them most was not how much had changed, but how much had remained the same. The same unanswered question. The same absence at the center of it all. Progress had narrowed the field, sharpened the focus, but the void was still there, demanding to be filled. The investigation moved forward anyway, because stopping was no longer an option. Whatever the outcome, whatever form resolution might take, the silence that had defined the case for so long had been broken. The story was speaking again, and this time, it was being heard. Somewhere ahead lay the moment when possibility would harden into fact, when implication would demand response. Until then, the pressure remained, steady and unrelenting, driving the case toward an end that no one could yet fully see, but everyone could feel drawing closer. The closer the investigation moved toward resolution, the heavier the atmosphere became, as if the case itself were resisting closure, pushing back with the weight of years spent unanswered. Every action now carried consequence. Every decision felt irreversible. There was no room left for hypothetical thinking. The story had narrowed to a corridor, and at the end of it waited something final, whether that finality came in the form of truth, or only the closest approximation justice could offer after so much time. Interviews intensified, not in volume but in focus. The same questions were asked again, now stripped of politeness, framed with context that made evasion harder. The person at the center of attention sat through them with an expression carefully neutral, but the effort showed. Shoulders stiffened. Answers shortened. Silence stretched longer between words. Lawyers intervened more frequently, their presence a constant reminder that the stakes had shifted from curiosity to consequence. Investigators compared transcripts side by side, not looking for contradictions so much as erosion. Stories told too many times tend to wear thin at the edges, revealing the shape beneath. Phrases repeated verbatim. Details delivered with unnatural precision. Other details conspicuously absent. It wasn't proof, but it was pattern, and pattern had become the investigation's most reliable guide. Financial records revealed movements that had once seemed random, now aligned with emerging timelines. Small withdrawals. Purchases that didn't match stated routines. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. But together, they suggested preparation, a quiet adjustment of behavior that preceded the disappearance, by just enough time to matter. The kind of preparation that doesn't announce intent, but anticipates necessity. The question of motive, long avoided because it felt speculative, began to take shape. Not a single explosive reason, but a slow accumulation of pressure. Personal conflicts that had been minimized. Situations that had been tolerated rather than resolved. Resentments allowed to calcify in silence. The investigation uncovered no grand plan, only the conditions under which an irreversible decision might suddenly feel possible. People who had once defended the central figure with certainty now hesitated when asked the same questions. Time had changed their perspective. Distance had stripped away loyalty. Some admitted, quietly, that there had been moments when things felt wrong, moments they had ignored because acknowledging them would have required action. Regret surfaced in these conversations, heavy and unresolved. Everyone had a version of the past they wished they had paid closer attention to. The physical search continued in parallel, not expecting miracles, but refusing to abandon the possibility. Specialized teams revisited areas once deemed irrelevant, guided by the refined theory. Soil samples were taken. Old containers examined. Places that had changed ownership were approached with careful diplomacy. Most yielded nothing. A few yielded ambiguity. The absence of definitive evidence remained the case's most stubborn obstacle. As pressure mounted, so did the risk of collapse. Investigators were keenly aware that if they pushed too hard without enough to hold, the entire effort could unravel. The legal system is unforgiving of overreach, especially when decades have passed. Every move had to be justified not just morally, but procedurally. Patience became a discipline rather than a strategy. The family watched developments unfold with a mixture of anticipation and dread. They had waited so long that the idea of an answer, any answer, felt almost unreal. Closure, once imagined as relief, now seemed complicated, layered with the knowledge that understanding what happened would not undo it. The disappearance had shaped their lives too deeply to be erased by resolution alone. Media attention sharpened again, driven by visible signs that something was happening behind the scenes. Reporters camped outside courthouses and offices, hoping for a statement, a name, a charge. Officials offered nothing beyond carefully worded acknowledgments. The silence was intentional. This phase of the story was not meant for headlines yet. It was meant for precision. Inside the investigative team, fatigue set in, not from lack of progress, but from the sustained intensity of focus. Cold cases ask investigators to carry two timelines at once, the urgency of the present and the weight of the past. Mistakes made decades earlier cast long shadows, and no one wanted to add a new one now. Every report was reread. Every assumption challenged. Then came the moment everyone had anticipated and feared in equal measure, a direct confrontation with the accumulated evidence laid out, not as accusation, but as narrative. A chance to respond to the story as it now stood. The room was quiet. The air heavy. Documents placed carefully on the table, each one a fragment of a larger picture. The response was measured, controlled, legally cautious. No confession. No dramatic breakdown. But something shifted. A hesitation where there hadn't been one before. A question asked that revealed more than it intended. Not an admission, but a misalignment, a subtle indication that the story being told no longer fit comfortably in the mouth of the person telling it. Afterward, investigators sat in silence, replaying every moment, every inflection. This was the point where cases either surged forward or stalled indefinitely. There was no certainty yet, but there was clarity. The path ahead was narrower than it had ever been. Behind closed doors, prosecutors were consulted. The standard was laid bare, probability was not enough. Implication was not enough. The case would have to stand without spectacle, without the emotional weight of years of suffering to prop it up. It would have to convince on its own terms, built from inference layered upon inference until doubt was reduced, not eliminated, but outweighed. The discussion was sober, unsentimental. This was not about vindication. It was about whether the truth, as reconstructed, could survive scrutiny. The answer was cautious, but not dismissive. There was a path. It would be difficult. It would be contested. But it existed. As night fell again over Sydney, the city unaware of how close it was to a reckoning with one of its oldest unanswered questions, the investigation reached a quiet pause. Not an end. A breath. A moment to prepare for what came next. The disappearance, once defined by absence, was now defined by presence, by the accumulation of detail, pressure, and possibility. The silence that had protected it for so long was thinning, stretched almost transparent. Whatever happened next would not bring the past back. It would not restore what had been lost. But it would answer the question that had haunted the city for decades, one way or another. And as the investigation edged closer to that answer, the weight of it pressed down on everyone involved, a reminder that some truths, once revealed, cannot be set down again, only carried forward into a future forever altered by their arrival. When the decision finally came to move forward, it did not arrive with ceremony. There was no dramatic announcement, no sense of triumph. It came quietly, through signatures on documents, through meetings that ended with nods rather than words, through an unspoken agreement that whatever happened next would change the shape of the story forever. The investigation had reached the point where waiting carried more risk than action. A charge, even a tentative one, is a rupture in a cold case. It forces everything into the open. Years of silence are replaced by a single, irreversible statement: "We believe we know what happened." The team understood this. They understood that once the threshold was crossed, there would be no retreat into ambiguity. The case would either hold or collapse under the weight of scrutiny. The arrest, when it came, was deliberately uneventful. No flashing lights. No drawn weapons. Just a quiet approach, practiced words, a hand resting briefly on an arm. The ordinariness of the moment was unsettling. This was not how decades of mystery were supposed to end. And yet, perhaps it was fitting. The disappearance itself had been quiet. No witnesses. No spectacle. Just a person stepping into absence. News traveled faster than any official statement could. By the time the confirmation reached the media, the city was already buzzing, phones lighting up with messages that carried the same question in different forms. Is it really happening? Headlines hedged their language, careful with verbs, cautious with conclusions. Breakthrough in Sydney cold case. Person charged in 2000 disappearance. Words chosen to acknowledge gravity, without promising certainty. For the family, the news landed with a force that defied description. Relief and shock arrived together, tangled and indistinguishable. For years, the absence had been the defining fact of their lives. Now it was being reframed, pulled into a narrative with names and allegations and dates. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like a door opening onto a room they had been afraid to enter, knowing that whatever waited inside would be permanent. The accused said little. Through counsel, they maintained restraint, offered no dramatic denial, no visible collapse. The restraint itself became part of the story, dissected by commentators, read for meaning it might not have carried. In courtrooms and newsrooms alike, the past was reconstructed again, this time for an audience hungry for resolution. Prosecutors laid out their case carefully, aware of its vulnerabilities. They spoke of timelines and opportunity, of behavior patterns and circumstantial weight. They acknowledged what they could not prove, and leaned into what they could suggest with consistency. The disappearance was no longer an abstract mystery. It was a sequence of events, fragile but coherent, assembled from decades of work and waiting. The defense responded with predictability, emphasizing the absence of physical evidence, the erosion of memory, the danger of inference layered upon inference. They spoke of reasonable doubt as a living thing, one that grows stronger with time, not weaker. They reminded everyone that suspicion, no matter how persuasive, is not the same as proof. The courtroom became a theater of restraint, emotion kept just beneath the surface. Witnesses spoke haltingly, aware that their words carried more weight now than they ever had before. Some struggled to remember details they had once dismissed. Others found themselves recalling moments with unexpected clarity, as if the act of finally being asked to account for them had unlocked something long sealed away. Outside, the city argued with itself. Talkback radio buzzed. Online forums lit up. Some were convinced justice had finally arrived. Others worried about the fragility of the case, about the possibility that desperation for answers had pushed investigators too far. The disappearance, once a shared mystery, now became a shared controversy. Investigators watched it all with a mix of detachment and quiet anxiety. Their work was no longer theirs alone. It was being tested, questioned, reframed by people who had not carried it for decades. This was the price of progress. Once a case enters the public arena, it belongs to everyone and no one at the same time. As proceedings unfolded, small details took on outsized importance. A discrepancy in timing. A phrase used differently years apart. An action that could be read as innocent or calculated, depending on perspective. The story flexed under examination, sometimes holding firm, sometimes bending uncomfortably close to breaking. The absence at the center of it all remained stubbornly unresolved. No remains were produced. No final location revealed. The person who had disappeared was still missing, their fate described but not demonstrated. This absence haunted every argument, a silent witness that could not be called to the stand. For the family, this was the hardest part. The legal process promised accountability, not answers. It could assign responsibility, without restoring what had been lost. Even a conviction would not tell them everything they wanted to know. Even an acquittal would not return them to the uncertainty they had once known. The past had already been altered by the act of trying to resolve it. As days in court turned into weeks, the city's attention ebbed and flowed. Some moved on, satisfied that something was finally happening. Others stayed glued to updates, unable to look away from a story that had shadowed their sense of safety for so long. The disappearance had become more than a case. It was a mirror, reflecting fears about how well anyone truly knows the people around them. Behind closed doors, investigators prepared themselves for any outcome. They had learned, over years of restraint and disappointment, not to equate effort with success. They believed in the story they had built, but belief was not enough. The system would decide whether the weight of probability could stand in for certainty. Late one night, as testimony concluded for the day, a detective stood outside the courthouse, listening to the city breathe around them. Traffic passed. Conversations drifted by. Life continued, indifferent to the gravity of what was unfolding inside. It struck them then how small the disappearance had been at the moment it occurred, and how enormous it had become with time. The case was no longer cold. It was no longer silent. But it was still unresolved in the way that mattered most. The truth hovered close, visible but not yet grasped, shaped by law as much as by fact. And as the trial pressed on, carrying with it decades of waiting, the question that had once seemed so simple returned in a more complex form, not just what happened, but what could ever be known for certain, and whether certainty itself was the only measure of justice worth pursuing. As the trial edged deeper into its core, the passage of time itself became a character in the room, invoked again and again, weighed, argued over, blamed and defended in equal measure. Years were counted aloud, not as numbers, but as distances, stretches of silence that prosecutors framed as concealment and the defense framed as decay. Memory was cross-examined as aggressively as any witness, its reliability questioned, its gaps exposed, its sudden flashes of clarity treated with suspicion. Witnesses returned to moments they had not spoken about in decades, their voices tightening as they tried to anchor feelings to dates, impressions to hours. Some spoke with confidence that surprised even them. Others faltered, the years having sanded down certainty until only impressions remained. The courtroom listened closely, parsing tone and hesitation, knowing that in a case like this, meaning often lived between words rather than inside them. Expert testimony followed, careful and restrained. Analysts explained how patterns emerge when direct evidence is absent, how behavior can be read over time, how absence itself can suggest action rather than chance. Charts were displayed. Timelines overlapped. The story was no longer just told. It was assembled in layers, each one fragile on its own, stronger when stacked together. The defense dismantled those layers methodically, not with drama, but with precision. They highlighted assumptions. They pointed out alternative explanations. They reminded the court that coincidence, however unlikely, is not impossible. They leaned heavily on the fact that the central absence remained intact. No body. No scene. No moment that could be definitively labeled as the end. Tension built not from confrontation, but from accumulation. Each day added weight. Each argument pushed the narrative slightly in one direction or another. Observers sensed that the outcome would not hinge on a single revelation, but on which version of uncertainty felt more tolerable, the uncertainty of believing guilt without physical proof, or the uncertainty of accepting that a disappearance could remain unresolved even after all this time. The accused sat through it all with measured stillness, expression guarded, eyes forward. Every gesture was scrutinized, every reaction interpreted and reinterpreted. Silence was read as discipline by some, as calculation by others. The absence of visible emotion became its own kind of evidence in the court of public opinion, though it held no official weight. Outside, commentary grew sharper. Former detectives debated the merits of the case. Legal analysts predicted outcomes with cautious language. The city watched itself react, divided not by sympathy for the victim, but by faith in the process. Some wanted resolution at any cost. Others feared the cost of resolution achieved too late, on evidence too thin. The family endured it all with quiet endurance. Their grief, long private, had become public property, analyzed alongside timelines and testimonies. They learned to keep their faces still, to absorb each development without revealing too much. This was not the catharsis they had imagined years ago. It was exposure, slow and relentless. As closing arguments approached, the narrative tightened once more. Prosecutors returned to simplicity, to the idea that while no single piece proved the case, the totality could not be ignored. They spoke of opportunity that aligned too perfectly, of behavior that deviated just enough to matter, of silence that persisted long after innocence would have demanded explanation. The defense responded with restraint, reminding the court that justice is not a feeling, that suspicion cannot substitute for proof, that time erodes truth as much as it reveals it. They argued that the story, however compelling, was still a story, built on inference rather than fact. When the jury was finally sent to deliberate, the room exhaled. Days of testimony collapsed into silence. The case retreated behind closed doors, where arguments would be replayed without cameras, without commentary, stripped down to their essentials. No one knew how long it would take. No one pretended to predict the outcome with confidence. Waiting returned, familiar and unwelcome. For the family, it felt like a cruel echo of the years before, another stretch of time defined by uncertainty. For investigators, it was a reckoning. Everything they had built now stood on its own, beyond their influence. The city held its breath in fragments. Updates were scarce. Rumors filled the gaps. Some claimed insight. Others claimed inside knowledge. Most of it dissolved under scrutiny, leaving behind the same central tension that had defined the case from the beginning. When the verdict finally came, it arrived without warning, summoned the room back into motion with a single word passed from hallway to hallway. People stood. Papers rustled. The weight of decades pressed into a moment measured in seconds. The decision, whatever it was, landed heavily. Not as an ending, but as a turning point. Gasps were audible. Faces shifted. The story bent, reshaped by the judgment of 12 people tasked with carrying an impossible burden. For some, it felt like justice. For others, like failure. For many, it was both at once. The legal question had been answered, but the emotional one remained stubbornly open. The disappearance was no longer just unsolved. It was unresolved in a new way, bound now to a verdict that could not restore what had been lost, only redefine how the loss would be remembered. As people filed out of the courtroom, the city resumed its noise, indifferent to the quiet devastation and cautious relief unfolding within its walls. The case that had haunted Sydney for so long had crossed another threshold, leaving behind certainty for some, doubt for others, and for everyone involved, the inescapable truth that even answers, when they finally come, rarely arrive whole. The aftermath settled slowly, like dust after a collapse, coating everything with a fine layer of consequence that no one could quite brush away. The verdict had been delivered, spoken aloud in a room that had held its breath for days, and now it echoed outward, reshaping conversations, memories, and beliefs in real time. There was no single reaction. Relief and anger coexisted. Vindication clashed with unease. The disappearance had entered a new phase, defined not by questions alone, but by interpretation. For the family, the days that followed were disorienting. The structure of waiting that had governed their lives for so long was gone, replaced by something less familiar and harder to navigate. There were no more updates to anticipate, no procedural milestones to mark the passage of time. Instead, there was space, vast and unsettling, filled with the knowledge that whatever the system had decided, the absence remained. Justice, in its official form, had spoken. Closure, in the personal sense, stayed elusive. They revisited memories with a new lens, replaying ordinary moments now weighted with implication. Conversations once remembered as benign took on sharper edges. Silences felt louder. The past, once frozen in uncertainty, began to move again, rearranging itself around the outcome. Knowing more did not simplify grief. It complicated it, layering understanding on top of loss without dissolving either. Investigators returned to their routines, but the case lingered with them, refusing to settle into the archive where other closed files rested. They analyzed their own work with the same scrutiny they had applied to evidence, questioning decisions, timing, restraint. Some felt validated. Others felt uneasy. Cold cases leave little room for certainty, even when the law declares an answer. The process had reached its conclusion, but the intellectual and emotional reckoning continued. Public discourse fractured along predictable lines. Some accepted the verdict as long overdue accountability, a testament to persistence and patience. Others fixated on what was missing, on the gaps that had never been filled, on the possibility that time itself had distorted the truth beyond reliable recognition. Opinion columns debated the ethics of delayed justice. Talkback radio turned the case into a referendum on memory, evidence, and trust. The accused, now defined by the outcome, receded from public view, becoming a symbol more than a person. Their name joined a list of others, invoked in discussions about cold cases and circumstantial prosecutions. Whatever they knew, whatever they felt, was no longer accessible. The legal system had drawn its boundary. Beyond it lay speculation, and nothing more. The city absorbed the story unevenly. Some neighborhoods felt the weight of it more than others, especially those closest to where the disappearance had begun. Old residents spoke in quieter tones. New ones listened with curiosity tinged by unease. The streets themselves looked unchanged, but the knowledge of what had been argued and decided beneath their lights altered how they were perceived. Familiar places became charged with memory. Journalists produced retrospectives, tracing the arc from vanishing to verdict, compressing decades into digestible narratives. Timelines were simplified. Complexities smoothed over. The story gained a shape it had never truly possessed while it was unfolding. For readers encountering it fresh, it appeared almost linear. For those who had lived inside it, that neatness felt artificial. Behind the scenes, unanswered questions persisted. Where exactly had the final moments unfolded? What happened in the seconds no one could account for? Why had certain choices been made, certain silences maintained? These questions had no procedural outlet now. They lingered in private conversations, in late-night thoughts, in the quiet recognition that some truths resist formal resolution. The investigation officially closed, its status updated, its file labeled resolved. The word looked definitive on paper. In reality, it was provisional, a statement of administrative fact rather than existential certainty. Resolution, in this context, meant that the system had reached the end of what it could reasonably do. It did not mean that every question had been answered, or that every doubt had been erased. For the family, anniversaries took on a different shape. They were no longer milestones of waiting, but moments of reflection, tinged with both validation and sorrow. Public sympathy shifted, less urgent now that the case had a conclusion. Grief, once shared by a curious city, returned to its private contours. Life, relentless in its forward motion, demanded adaptation once again. Investigators spoke about the case in measured terms when asked, careful not to dramatize, careful not to undermine the outcome. Privately, they acknowledged the cost of persistence, the years spent circling a truth that had refused to surface easily. Cold cases, they knew, rarely offer clean endings. They offer approximations, shaped by law, evidence, and time's distortions. The disappearance remained part of Sydney's collective memory, but its meaning shifted. It was no longer just a mystery. It was a lesson, a cautionary tale about how absence can stretch across decades, how ordinary lives can conceal extraordinary consequences, how certainty is often constructed rather than discovered. The case was cited in training sessions, in academic discussions, in debates about reform. Its legacy extended beyond its facts. At night, the city still moved as it always had, lights reflecting on water, streets humming with quiet life. People walked paths once walked by someone who never returned, most of them unaware, some of them thinking about it in passing. The disappearance had become part of the city's unseen architecture, a story embedded in place rather than time. And yet, despite verdicts and labels and official conclusions, something unresolved persisted. Not a legal question, but a human one. The need to know, fully and completely, what happened in that final stretch of time and why. The system had done what it could. The rest belonged to memory, to imagination, to the spaces between facts. As the years continued to move forward, the case settled into history, not as a closed book, but as a chapter that refused to end neatly. Its impact rippled outward in subtle ways, shaping how future disappearances would be investigated, how silence would be interpreted, how patience would be measured. The story had reached its formal conclusion. The voice of the law had spoken. But the echo of the disappearance lingered, soft and insistent, a reminder that resolution is not the same as peace, and that some absences, once they enter the world, never fully leave it. Long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded into archives, the disappearance continued to live a quieter life, one not measured by verdicts or broadcasts, but by the way it lingered in thought. It surfaced in pauses during conversations, in the way people hesitated before saying they believed they finally knew the truth. It appeared in the reluctance to call the story finished, even when the language of the law insisted it was. Time moved forward, as it always does, indifferent to human longing. New cases replaced old ones in the news cycle. New faces occupied the spaces once dominated by familiar names. Yet beneath the churn, the case remained fixed, not as breaking news, but as a reference point, a shadow cast across every discussion of disappearance and delayed justice that followed. For the family, life became an exercise in coexistence with an answer that never fully answered. They learned how to carry the outcome without letting it define every moment, though it never entirely loosened its grip. Some days felt lighter, as if certainty, however incomplete, had relieved a pressure they had carried for decades. Other days were heavier, burdened by the realization that no future revelation would rewrite the past. The ending, such as it was, had already been written. They spoke less to the media now, choosing privacy over explanation. Their story had been told and retold, filtered through strangers' voices, shaped into narratives that sometimes felt unrecognizable. What remained was theirs alone, memories unshared, questions unasked, a relationship frozen in its final chapter. Closure, they discovered, was not a moment. It was a negotiation, repeated endlessly, between acceptance and refusal. In investigative circles, the case became shorthand for both perseverance and caution. It was cited as proof that time does not necessarily erase accountability, and as a warning about the fragility of truth when stretched across decades. Detectives debated it in training rooms and conferences, dissecting choices made under pressure, examining how early assumptions can harden into barriers that last years. The case taught without offering comfort. The city itself seemed to absorb the lesson quietly. Sydney did not memorialize the disappearance with monuments or plaques. Instead, it folded the story into its subconscious, where it surfaced in subtler ways. A late-night walk felt different on certain streets. An unanswered phone call carried a heavier silence. People locked doors, checked in, hesitated, not because they remembered the details, but because the idea of vanishing had been given a shape they could not forget. The places connected to the case continued their ordinary existence. Cafes reopened under new names. Houses changed owners. Sidewalks wore smooth beneath countless footsteps. Nothing marked them as significant to a stranger's eye, yet they held a quiet charge for those who knew. Geography had become evidence once, briefly, and then returned to being simply space, indifferent and enduring. Public opinion softened with time, drifting from certainty back toward ambiguity. Those who had once argued fiercely grew quieter, less invested in proving themselves right. The story no longer demanded allegiance. It invited reflection instead. People began to ask different questions, less about guilt or innocence, more about what it meant to live so long without answers, and what it cost to finally receive one that could never be complete. The disappearance resisted being sealed off as history. It intruded unexpectedly, resurfacing when similar cases emerged, when technology promised new breakthroughs, when another family stood before cameras asking for help. Its echo was unmistakable. This had happened before. This could happen again. And the distance between now and then offered no immunity. At its core, the case was never just about what happened on a single day in the year 2000. It was about absence, and how absence behaves over time. How it stretches, adapts, embeds itself into routines and relationships. How it transforms from shock into endurance, from urgency into quiet persistence. The verdict addressed an act. It did not resolve the phenomenon. Those who had followed the story from the beginning sometimes struggled to articulate why it still mattered. They could not always recall dates or names, but they remembered the feeling. The unease. The sense that something ordinary had fractured without warning. That feeling endured, detached from specifics, powerful precisely because it was unresolved in the ways that mattered most. Even now, there were moments when the story seemed to hold its breath again, as if waiting for something else to surface. A forgotten detail. A misplaced object. A confession that never came. These moments passed, of course, dissolving back into everyday noise, but they revealed how thin the boundary was between resolution and doubt. The disappearance had been declared resolved, but its meaning remained fluid, reshaped by each person who encountered it. For some, it was a story about justice delayed but delivered. For others, it was a reminder of how much can be lost between certainty and proof. For many, it was simply a haunting example of how a life can exit the world without ceremony, leaving behind questions that outlive everyone who asked them. As years turned into decades, the case receded further from the present, but it did not fade. It settled into a deeper layer of awareness, where it no longer demanded attention, but quietly influenced it. It altered expectations. It sharpened skepticism. It reminded those who listened that endings are often constructed, not discovered. In the end, the story did not conclude with a revelation or a confession, but with a shared, uneasy understanding. That some truths arrive incomplete. That some answers satisfy the law, but not the heart. That disappearance, once it happens, never truly reverses. It only changes form. The city continued on, illuminated each night by the same lights, reflected in the same water. People came and went. Lives unfolded and concluded. Somewhere within that constant motion, the echo of a vanished presence remained, not loud enough to disrupt, not quiet enough to forget. And that is where the story rests. Not solved in the way mysteries promise to be solved, but settled into the fabric of memory, where it will remain, unresolved in spirit, long after the final word has been spoken. There is a moment, long after the noise has died down, when the story becomes almost weightless. No headlines. No court dates. Just a quiet awareness that something once torn open has settled, not healed, but settled, like sediment at the bottom of still water. This is where the case lives now. Not in evidence lockers or transcripts, but in the soft, persistent space between memory and forgetting. Years pass. New routines replace old ones. The city sheds the tension it once carried in its shoulders, though it never quite forgets how it felt. On certain nights, when the air is heavy and the streets are nearly empty, the past feels closer. Not visible. Not audible. Just nearer than it should be. As if absence itself has a gravity. The name is spoken less often now. When it is, it lands differently. No longer as a question, not quite as an answer. More like a reference point. A reminder that certainty has limits, and that time does not resolve everything it touches. Some stories end because they must. Others end because there is nowhere left for them to go. In quiet homes, photographs remain where they always were. Not displayed for explanation, not hidden out of pain. Simply present. They watch the years move on without them. Birthdays arrive and pass. Anniversaries soften at the edges. Grief evolves, not into acceptance, but into something more livable, something that can exist alongside laughter without canceling it out. Investigators, now older, sometimes think back to the case without meaning to. A smell. A street corner. A phrase overheard in passing. They wonder, briefly, if anything was missed, if some small detail still sits unnoticed in the margins of memory. The thought never lasts long. It doesn't need to. The work has already taken its shape inside them. The verdict remains, solid and immovable in records and databases, but its emotional outline blurs with distance. What once felt definitive becomes contextual. People argue about it less. They talk about it more softly, if at all. The story no longer demands belief or disbelief. It simply exists, settled into the long shelf of things that happened and cannot be unhappened. Sometimes, a stranger stumbles across the case for the first time. Late at night. A documentary clip. An old article resurfacing online. They feel the familiar chill, the same one others felt decades earlier. For them, it is new. For the world, it is an echo. The story renews itself briefly, then fades again, unchanged by being remembered. And somewhere in the city, life continues in small, unremarkable ways. Doors close. Lights turn off. Footsteps fade into distance. People assume they will arrive where they are going. Most of the time, they do. The assumption holds. The world remains intact. But every so often, the thought returns, uninvited and persistent, that someone once did not arrive. That the gap they left behind was large enough to stretch across years, across courtrooms, across an entire city's sense of certainty. That even when answers come, they do not always fill the space they were meant to fill. This is not a conclusion. It is a resting point. The story does not ask to be reopened. It does not insist on being finished. It simply remains, quietly, as proof that disappearance is not an event, but a condition. One that outlives investigations. One that reshapes those who brush against it. One that never fully releases its hold. And so the city moves forward, carrying the echo with it, softened by time, but never erased. Somewhere between resolution and doubt, between justice and longing, the case finds its final form. Not solved. Not forgotten. Just still.